So I wanted to start today with a quote, and then we'll share a little bit more about what we'll be doing. I think it's a general part of the human experience that we're all spiritual in some way. It shapes the way that you believe and the way that you present your beliefs to others. This quote came to us from Grace, who is 19. She was a participant in one of our early focus groups. She had self-identified as moderately spiritual and slightly religious. So thank you all for being here today. We are really excited to welcome you to this launch of the spirituality study that Fetzer's been working on the past few years. What does spirituality mean to us? A study of spirituality in the United States. I'm Jillian Gonda. I'm the program director for movement building at the Fetzer Institute, and I've been working on this project along with some of my dear colleagues at Fetzer and at Hadaway Communications. I'll share more about who we are. But I just wanted to start with that quote just because I think it really does epitomize what we're talking about, that this experience of spirituality is a human experience, and that is what we've known these years at Fetzer, and it's certainly what this research showed. So we're so glad that you're all here today. We're seeing that people are still joining in. I wanted to just give you a few housekeeping tips as we join in on this kind of webinar mode. Hopefully many of you have experienced Zoom in webinar mode, but it's just a little different from the typical Zoom calls that we spend most of our hours and days in. What's the same is that you have your chat room, so please use the chat box there to communicate with your fellow attendees for this webinar. You can talk to them and you can just share your general comments and what you're experiencing throughout the next hour and a half. What I'd like to also point your attention to, though, is the Q&A. We have a whole Q&A mode with a webinar, so you can submit your questions to myself, others at Fetzer, and for our panelists in that. And as early as right now, if you want to start submitting questions, we do have a moderator behind the scenes who's going to be looking at those to answer some of the simple ones, but we'll also be looking at those when we get into our Q&A section. So please use that Q&A mode. You'll be seeing us and the panelists here today. Unfortunately, we can't see you, but we know you're out there. And we hope that we'll be hearing from you either in the chat or in the Q&A module. So there's a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this webinar. We'll be sharing it out afterwards. And we finally do have a graphic note taker as well. If you've experienced any of our very talented graphic recorders, you'll see some of those lovely notes coming out afterwards. They're definitely a treat. So we'll be sharing that out as well as the recording. So I'd like to just share a little bit of who is with us today. So we have a wonderful panel. I'm joined by my colleagues at the Fetzer Institute, Bob Boyster, our president. I'm also joined by Mohammed, a partner in crime with this wonderful project, senior program officer at Fetzer. Welcome, Mohammed. We are also joined by Veronica Selzler, who's been along the entire journey from the very moment when this was just a gleam in our eye. Veronica Selzler has been leading this work from Hadaway Communications. They've been our partner research and communications firm based in Washington, D.C. So glad that you're with us today, Veronica. And we have very lucky to have 4 of our advisors that also were really there from the very beginning. I'd like to introduce Tom W. Smith. He's from the University of Chicago at NORC, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Study of Politics and Society. Welcome, Tom. We also have Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. He's the Executive Director at Sojourners. Thank you, and thank you for being here, Adam. Welcome. We have C. Vanessa White, Vanessa, as we call Vanessa. She's Associate Professor of Spirituality and Ministry at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for being here. And finally, we have Omar McRoberts. He's also in Chicago at the University of Chicago, Associate Professor of Sociology. Thank you for being here, Omar. All of these advisors remember the very early days when we started to think about this project and what it could do for Fetzer. And I'm so glad that they're here with us today to kind of see now this moment where it's out there, it's alive and well in the world. So, so thank you for being here to talk a little bit more about it. We have published the study today, so it is a real live thing out in the world. Please visit spiritualitystudy.org. You may want to be looking at it even during some of this time. It's a really unique way that you can explore the findings through our interactive module there, so you can see quite a bit of what the study looks like. And I'll show a little bit about this, the website towards the end of our call today. On the website, you can actually download the report. It looks just beautiful. We'll have some limited copies available that we'll be mailing out. It's kind of rare to get something physical these days, and we hope that some of you may receive that. So let's begin our program today. We're going to talk a little bit more about what led us to do this research, why this was important for Fetzer. We'll share about some of the key findings and what we think is really significant in the research. We'll talk a little bit about the methodology, and then really, I think the bulk of our conversation will be on what are the implications for today. We find ourselves in very challenging moments, and I think that there are some moments of hope in this research that can help us as we navigate the weeks and months and years ahead. So I'll just say to begin with that the spiritual dimension of life has been long significant for the Fetzer Institute. And no one knows this more than our current and beloved president, Bob Boyster. So I wanted to turn it over to you, Bob, to just welcome our participants and start off with offering why was this research something that you thought the Institute should embark on? Why do you think this is significant? And we'll share more later in the program about the implications for today. But just wanted to start off with you making a few words about why the study is important. Thank you, Bob. I'll turn it over to you.
There we go. I think, can you hear me now? Yes, great. Well, first off, a huge gratitude to all of you out there who decided this was an important topic and you are committing this time. And I think you will find that your instinct was correct. I want to begin with a couple of other gratitudes, which I think is very much in the spirit of this subject. First to Jillian and Mohammed on our Fetzer team who have led this effort from the beginning. Veronica Seltzer from our partners Hadaway in Washington, critical thought partner and author, the wonderful research team at NORC at the University of Chicago, and our great advisors. This has been a huge effort, and it reflects Fetzer's longstanding commitment to rigorous research to inform our understanding of important topics in a way that supports effective action. At Fetzer, our mission is helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. We lift up love because we think it's the only force powerful enough to overcome all the things that are pulling us apart and pulling us down. And we lift up spirituality because we feel that the challenge of opening our hearts profoundly in love to each other is fundamentally a spiritual challenge. So the exciting thing for me about this study is it demonstrates conclusively that the great majority of Americans agree. They agree that this spiritual dimension of life, that place in our lives where we wrestle with the deepest questions of meaning and value and purpose, is profoundly important. As you'll hear more, the majority of Americans not only say it's important, it becomes more important the more we want of it. And we see that across all of our dimensions of difference, that belief is shared, and that Americans work on a weekly basis to deepen their spiritual lives through a broad range of practice. The last thing I'll say in terms of what excites me about this study is that the study demonstrates a strong connection between our inner spiritual lives and our level of engagement and the way we engage in the world. The more spiritual the respondent, the deeper obligation they felt to engage in our common life, and even more important, the values that animated their engagement in our common life are the pro-social values that we so desperately need. So there's big news and highly timely news here. And with that, Jillian, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Yeah, that's beautiful. I think this connection between our inner lives and our outer lives is something that has long informed Fetzer and our work. In fact, our guiding purpose compels us to look at the integration of the inner life with the outer life of service and action. So I think as we thought years ago, looking at our mission to build a spiritual foundation, it really became critical to us to understand, well, what does that mean right now? What is this moment that we find ourselves? How are Americans, and frankly, around the world, how are we thinking and talking, behaving around spirituality? We wanted to move slightly from what had been studies that had really explored and continue to, rightfully, the trends, the demographic trends, but that wasn't telling us enough about really how is that experienced at the personal level. We also wanted to move away from maybe predefined studies of spirituality, where the idea of what spirituality is already known, and they're asking about participants' experience based on that definition. So we would kind of wanted a study that would be a little bit bottom up. And again, as Bob said, really looking at what is happening in the spiritual life in this moment in time. So that's how we started out with our questions. I want to move into a section where we'll share a little bit more about our key findings, and happy to introduce Veronica here. So as we were reflecting on this, we really did kind of come up in these early conversations with our advisors, these key research questions, basically looking at first the inner life. We wanted to understand, how do people experience spirituality for themselves? How do they understand the concept, and how do they experience it? And we also wanted to connect that then to this outer world. This was at the time of the beginning of this research, and it continues to be a significant part of our work. We've been focusing on democracy and healing the heart of American democracy. What kind of questions could we ask here that may help us understand how people connect to their inner lives, to their outer world? How does spirituality relate to the ways they engage with others and their community? So these were our overarching questions. And then we designed a study that would help us find out a little bit more. I'm going to introduce Veronica now, who really has, as I said, been there from the beginning. Veronica, why don't you take it away and share a little bit more about our key findings?
Excellent. All right, so let me speak a little bit about the research process and design. Again, a huge well of gratitude to the advisors and reviewers, some of whom you see here, some of whom I expect are listening in, have said they will join. Just a huge thank you to helping shape this process. So the big idea of the research process was to understand those two questions that Jillian just spoke to. So it culminated in a nationally representative survey of 3,600 people in the US. And to get there, to build that survey, we started by listening. We started by listening to people of all spiritual and religious backgrounds and identities from across the country. And so we hosted 16 focus groups in Birmingham, Phoenix, Seattle, Boston, and Des Moines. We also spoke to a whole host of folks over the course of 26 in-depth interviews to get more deep and personal in terms of what spirituality means for people in their lives. Again, thanks to the advisors and reviewers for helping shape all of those questions and identify the themes and findings that we drew from the research throughout. So to speak to what we learned, I want to start by sharing two brief stories that came out of the focus groups that illustrate some of these big ideas about what we learned or what spirituality means to people and how it relates to civic action. So I first want to introduce you to Daniel. Here is a picture of Daniel, drawn by Daniel, praying to Jesus. In the spirit of not defining spirituality and letting people share what it means for themselves, we started off focus groups by asking people to draw a picture. What does spirituality mean to you? And this is what Daniel drew. Now, let me tell you why this was so perplexing for us as researchers. He's describing, I talk to God a lot. That means praying a lot, talking, having a connection with him. You will see Daniel identified as very spiritual and not religious at all. For someone who would fall into this category of spiritual but not religious, this was not what we expected to see. In fact, we are on the other side of the one-way mirror, getting nervous, saying, oh my gosh, what happened with the recruiting? What is going on? And as we dug deeper, we started to understand why. Daniel explained that he doesn't go to church all the time. He doesn't, quote, do all the Christian things like they say you're supposed to. But to oversimplify, to be religious for him meant going to church, and spirituality was his relationship with God. So this and many other conversations showed us that these labels of spiritual and religious identity don't fully capture the nuance and diverse lived experiences of spirituality and religion today. So another example of something that we witnessed over and over. In focus groups, after exploring ideas around spirituality, we shifted to talk about the way people engage in their communities. Things like knowing their neighbors, volunteering, voting, and then we listened for how people connected the two conversations. Some people, like Natalie, dismissed the possibility that spirituality and the essential civic act of voting were connected. You can see here for my definition. For me, my definition of spirituality was always very personal. That's why I don't think that voting connects with my spirituality. And then over and over again, we watched advocates like Kendra step in. Kendra pushes back. That's kind of exactly why I think the opposite. Because of spirituality and the way that I'm connected to other people, it absolutely informs the decisions that I make in terms of how I believe politically. She explains how her spirituality, in this case, specifically a sense of connection to other people, is intrinsically tied to her political action. And this points to a few key findings in the research backed by the survey, that a sense of spirituality and civic life are closely correlated. Not everyone connects them, but the connection was for many latent. In conversation, we watched people's eyes open to the relationship between the two. And thus, what we learned about those key research questions, that spirituality is a complex, diverse, nuanced phenomenon that people of all spiritual and religious identities experience. And the more a person identifies as spiritual, the strongest spiritual identities, the more likely they are to take civic and political action. So I want to spend a few moments sharing some of the key findings from the report. There's much more to explore, and I know that every time personally that I dive in, there's something new that stands out. And so again, invite you to check out spiritualitystudy.org, dig into the report, play around with the resources that we've shared there. So this is just a taste. To start, a vast majority of people consider themselves both spiritual and religious. 70% of people consider themselves both religious and spiritual. Again, it's two different questions that we've overlapped and mapped these groups. 16% spiritual but not religious, 11% neither, and 3% only religious. This last piece, the 3% religious only, is interesting, and noting the flip side means that 97% of those who say they are religious also consider themselves spiritual. So really understanding that these are two concepts that for many are closely tied, and we delve in further about how people understand the relationship between the two in the report. As Bob mentioned, Many also see spirituality as an aspirational identity. That is the type of person they want to be, the values that drive them, the way they want to live their lives. 3 in 5 people said that they aspire to be more spiritual, and you can see really strongly agree. People like Sarah and others describe spirituality as a journey, something that they are working toward. Here Sarah describes something I'm working towards, which is having a richer, more wise, and at peace understanding of the world. I hope with age I'll get there, but I'm not there yet. And again, we continue to see people over and over describe spirituality and spiritual people that they had in their minds as these positive aspirational qualities that they were also working toward. We saw it play out in the data too. Nearly half of people say that they have become more spiritual over the course of their lives. So here we have 25% of folks consistently identified as spiritual. Nearly half identify as more spiritual now than in their past. Here's one of those folks that we talked to, Mark, who found a more spiritual life through Buddhism, meditation. He describes in this interview that we had with him in the past year, I've been getting more into reading Buddhist texts, listening to podcasts, practicing meditation. We'll look at some of those activities in just a moment. It's been big in just making sure that I'm being the best person that I can be. Again, those aspirational qualities. We also heard from others who found a growing sense of spirituality within their own existing religious practice. So speaking of those activities, 88% of people said that they engage in at least one spiritual or religious activity at least once a week. So during the interviews and focus groups, we listened for the activities that people engage in that they described as spiritual or religious. And so together with the advisors, we reviewed and developed a list of 17 practices. So here's just a selection, and investigated how many people engage in them and how often as spiritual practices and as religious practices. So these spiritual activities, you can see, so it's a whole host of ones that maybe fit into a traditional understanding of religion, like attending a religious service, to some more diverse activities, art, being in nature, acts of service. Now shifting to the relationship between spirituality and civic action. The more strongly a person identifies as spiritual, the more likely they are to believe it's important to engage in all kinds of pro-social actions, to believe it's important to make a difference, to contribute to greater good. And so I'm going to show a lot on this chart. You're not going to be able to process all of it right now, but hopefully that's a tease to dig in more deeply into the report. But as you can see, as people's spirituality, self-identified spirituality increases, that across all sorts of measures, this list of things that people say are very important, like making a difference in my community, being informed of community issues. As people's spirituality increases, so does the likelihood that they believe these things are very important. Similarly, they're saying that they take those actions, that they engage with others in their community, taking actions such as volunteering and donating. Again, as people identify as more spiritual, they're also more likely to believe that these things describe them very well, that they make an effort to interact with strangers, attend community events, donate to causes or organizations that are important to them. And finally, they are also more likely to take political action, to vote, to speak out on political social issues, get involved in politics and social issues. They're more likely to say that they have done these activities over the past 12 months. That also includes those who say they always vote. Those who say they're only slightly spiritual, 38% say they always vote. 56 of those who say they're very spiritual say they always vote. So again, a lot here. I encourage you to dig in to the report itself at spiritualitystudy.org, but a teaser of some of the things that we were finding. Coming back to that initial conversation about the relationship, so we see a correlation between spirituality and civic engagement. How do people actually understand that relationship? Would they describe it that way? Now, 40% of people say that their spirituality influences their civic engagement. You also see that a quarter strongly disagree, and another quarter don't express one way or another. And this is in line with things that we were hearing in focus groups and in conversations with folks, that many people had actually never even considered the question of whether spirituality and their civic engagement or their political engagement was related. Just under half of people say that their spirituality influences their political views. So we've got 45% of folks that say their spirituality influences their political views. Again, a good chunk of people who aren't picking a side. I don't want to say they don't know, but they say neither agree nor disagree. And again, a strong cohort who strongly disagree. Even fewer say that spirituality influences their political activities. Again, 28 who neither agree nor disagree, 28% who strongly disagree. Now you could see this and maybe feel a little bit disappointed depending on what your interests are. But one of the things that was so important to us, coming back to that initial story I shared about Natalie and Kendra, and many others, who in conversation with others started to see this latent relationship between spirituality and civic action. So here's a quote from William from a focus group conversation, who in conversation with others, again, just listening and watching this play out as we saw advocates step up and really push for the connection that they saw and they deeply understood between their own spirituality and the way that they engage in their communities and in their politics, saying, before I came in here, I didn't really think about a connection between politics and spirituality, but this was thought-provoking regarding that. I think I see it now. And he was not alone in that experience. It was a really exciting conversation to watch over and over again, and something that, from Fetzer's perspective, I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of hope in terms of what this could lead to in inspiring action. Again, another plug, check it out, but that is just a taste of all the insights that we were able to glean from this listening exercise over the last 2 years.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was really wonderful. And yes, there is a lot to explore in the website. And again, you can download the report to see many more charts and graphs and these different kind of thinking about these different sections that come up, whether it be practice or accountability or connection, which is really this idea of connection that Veronica just ended on. One of the more significant findings and really implications, I think, for this research. And I will say, as we've shared some of these findings with some of our closest partners, they too doing similar work and understanding where we are in America right now, that this opportunity to make connection and be in conversation is really where true change will happen. So I think there's a real obligation with some of these findings that we take that to heed. And I think for many of you listening, there may be ways that you can apply that to your work. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you all for your participation. Wonderful to see your introductions in the chat, who you are and where you're coming from. Thank you for the questions that are coming up. We'll get to those in just a moment. I did want to just acknowledge who you are. So this is not, we didn't publicly do this launch out into the world. We invited our partner network, our ecosystem, friends of our partners that are part of this, this wider mission that we're all kind of a part of, helping to create a more loving world. And we also have among us today are those who have signed up early on when we started to talk about this study publicly that said, hey, I'm someone who's interested in this and want to follow along. So that's who's in your fellow attendee group, and we're so glad that you're with us today. So we wanted to thank you, Veronica, again, for walking us through those findings. We want to talk a little bit more about just the substance of this research and the design. I want to start off before I move over to Tom and Mohammed to share a few words, just to acknowledge, as we did at the beginning, that we have at Fetzer from time to time, looked at research within the walls of Fetzer, our team, and what it would mean for Fetzer to do that. Mohammed will share a little bit more, but I will say that in those decades of experience really working with scholars, how essential it is to do that. How essential it is to bring in both scholars and practitioners in the field of study that we were looking at. So that was by design that we brought in a number of advisors and reviewers, and they're among the audience as well with us today. And I wanted to acknowledge who that was. You've met our key advisors that are on the panel. In addition, Ruth Bronstein, she's an amazing sociologist at the University of Connecticut, looks at the intersection of religion and politics. Reverend Sue Phillips, who's from the Sacred Design Lab, we're glad to have her along as an advisor. Lynn Underwood, former at the very beginning days of Fetzer. Lynn Underwood is a senior research associate at the International Center for Ethics at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that list. And finally, Krista Tippett, who a longtime partner and friend of the Fetzer Institute. We were so grateful to have her alongside this research. And as we got into fielding the survey, designing the survey, the questionnaire that went out across the country, and then analyzing those results, we brought in Nancy Ammerman from Boston University, professor of sociology of religion, Reverend Daniel Grudy from Notre Dame, Vice President and Associate Provost, Pamela King from the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller Theological Seminary, Elizabeth Lynn from the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at Indiana University at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Alyssa Perkins in our backyard of Kalamazoo, Associate Professor, Department of Comparative Religion, Bill Venley, Secretary General Emeritus of Religions for Peace International and a Senior Advisor for World Religions at Fetzer. Roman Williams, who's a noted visual sociologist, and as you noted, as Veronica pointed out, the visual drawings were really a significant part of the qualitative stage of this research. He's from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, executive officer there. And Charlotte Van Ooyen Wheatvliet, I knew I was gonna mess it up. I'm sorry, Charlotte, I practiced. Also in our backyard in Michigan, she's from Hope College, professor of psychology, and has been with us before at Fetzer as we did some research on forgiveness. So I just wanted to really call these names out because it was part of the design principle to really move beyond just what Fetzer thought would be a good study, to bring in both scholars and practitioners to help us think this through. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and move over to Mohammed. You know, you and I, Mohammed, had shared quite a bit of design thinking as we went into this. You and I have different hats on this project. So I was really coming at this research from a communications perspective at Fetzer. This is a big mission. These are big ideas. How do we understand how to talk about this concept of spirituality that's so important to us? So that's where my hat was. Mohammed, you came in at a slightly different angle looking at the research work that Fetzer had done over the years. So I wondered if you could just share a little bit more about that perspective of research at Fetzer.
Thank you, Jillian. First, I would like to thank the Fetzer team, Bob, our board, our advisors, and our reviewers. As you can imagine, there were so many people involved in this. It was also an experiment into how this works. We had academics, practitioners, interdisciplinary scholars, reviewers, and a communications company, Hathaway, the Fetzer Institute. So it's a collaboration between philanthropy, academia, practitioner organizations out in the world, and yeah, all of these partners work together to make it possible. If you look at the history of surveys at Fetzer, I was asking Tom, the last time they did, GSS collaborated with Fetzer was 1998. They did a module within the GSS on religion. And then we had another survey in 2010 on love and forgiveness. And this is the third major, probably this is the largest and more resource intensive survey we have done at Fetzer, involving so many people and probably about 3 years. Before that, I had a conversation with Tom about how this can be done, just out of curiosity and to explore the possibility of doing something like this in order to understand our mission. Because if you look at our mission statements, they're sort of hypotheses of sorts. Currently, it's helping build a spiritual foundation for a loving world. So if we have such a mission, it is critical for us to understand what spirituality is, what love is. Our research in 2010 on love and forgiveness, 94% of the people said America needs meaningful love. Now we're exploring spirituality, and the majority of people are aspiring to be spiritual. Even those who claim to be strongly spiritual, they aspire to be more spiritual. It's an endless journey. So we brought together a multidisciplinary circle of advisors and reviewers to make this possible. But we want this to be, this is not the end. This is the launch, but this is not the end. We are also planning to have more conversations, as well as more publications coming out of this. We'll make the data available to basically anyone, but there are a few people already starting to write academic papers that will be published in peer-reviewed journals. So this in brief is how we did this, and I'm really happy. It generated a lot of excitement, and I'm looking forward to many conversations going forward. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you, Mohammed. Tom, I just wanted to turn it over to you, as you've been, as Mohammed shared with the General Social Survey, long been looking at trends in spirituality and religion, and certainly know this space really well. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, Tom, how did you see this, how do you see this contributing toward the field of spirituality research? What and why this inductive approach? Why was that a significant one for us to undertake?
So Fetzer started off with building on the foundation of what theologians and sociologists and religion and others have determined about religion and spirituality in America, and really advanced it quite a bit beyond that. It has greater breadth. It covers more aspects of spirituality than previous studies. It also has greater depth. As you saw from the drawings and the personal statements people made, we got people to speak in their own voices about spirituality, about that. So great depth to that. And then it was also highly representative. You have a nationally representative sample of over 3,600 people that were interviewed about this. And this is particularly important for spirituality because a lot of the studies have been very small scale. Some very interesting personal experiences, but just very small samples, and ones you can't generalize to, and you can't look at quantitative connections, as we saw in some of the previous presentations, between spirituality and social action, spirituality and trying to take and make society better. And that is really what the way this study of Fetzer moved things on. In terms of the inductive, it depends a little bit on what one means by this, but I think the way to think about this is we had the survey very broad, and we allowed people to take and tell their stories. And from that, we developed very meaningful and very powerful information about the internal aspects of spirituality and its social connections.
Wonderful, Tom. Thank you so much. And I think that is that point that you ended on, from to the social connections, the personal experience to the social connections, is really an important way to transition into, I think, what so many are probably thinking about today, and certainly what Omar and Bob and Vanessa and Adam, who I think just went away. I don't know what happened to Adam. Hopefully he'll come back. But this is really what the question has been for us. What is this moment that we find ourselves in, and how do we connect? Here's Adam again. How do we connect the spiritual to our outer concerns? So I want to start with you, Bob. You've been thinking and talking about this a lot lately, just this moment that we find ourselves in. And boy, every week there's a new moment. I think that we find ourselves today in a very different moment than we were a week ago in terms of how we feel about our civic life and what's happening in our world. So I just want to start there, Bob. How do you see this now, as you've heard the findings again? How do you see this playing out in this moment today?
Great question. And I'll start by noting that this research was completed before our world turned upside down earlier in this year. And it seems like it keeps turning upside down. We're in the midst of this pandemic experience that I think has increased our stress levels, both as individuals and as a society, tremendously. And we're beginning to see the negative mental health fallout from that. We're dealing with this long overdue racial reckoning, which is bringing into the surface deep divides that have been there all along. And now we are moving into this intensely polarizing presidential campaign. And I think what comes up for me as I reflect on the relevance of these findings is what this study is telling us about both the significance of spirituality, both at the individual level and at the level of our common life. If you think of the challenge right now for us as individuals to try to find a solid place to stand, to find the inner equilibrium and peace and hope and love to enable us to be resilient enough to then look outward beyond our own immediate situation to the critical need for bridging divides, for healing. I think what this study is telling us is that spirituality is a tremendously important resource. When the study asked participants, what are the words that come up? If you can when we say spirituality, if you can visualize a word cloud, the biggest word would be peace. The next biggest word would be love. The next biggest word would be inspiration, then values, then purpose. I think that visual image says it all. These are personal attributes that have become even more important than they were already important. Then when the study asked people, what do you think of when you think of a spiritual person? And I want to read because it's such a powerful experience. Spiritual people are people that have positive attitudes, such as being happy and joyful, positive characteristics, such as being humble, calm, and centered, and they relate to others in positive ways, such as being compassionate, generous, or caring. If that's what spirituality gives us, first off, I want it. But I think from the perspective of our common life, those are attributes that are, number one, in short supply, and number two, desperately needed. So if that's what spirituality is all about, I think it becomes a hugely important topic for our national conversation as well as our personal lives. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Bob. Great. I want to invite in our other panelists. We have Omar, Adam, and Vanessa, all who have been reflecting on what this research tells us, but also reflecting in their own lines of work, where we are in this moment and how it reflects to our past and where we are today. So Omar, this has certainly been a study of interest to you, looking even historically at times of civil unrest. What are you finding in this research that's helpful for you, and how do you relate it to your previous work?
Well, this finding that people identifying as spiritual or religious are more civically engaged, generally people who do not identify as spiritual or religious, is really important. It's also important that people identifying as spiritual but not particularly religious also tend to be more civically engaged. But the connection between spirituality and civic engagement is historically borne out. When we look at the history of social movements in the United States, and I think of this in light of the still recent passing of the great civil rights movement icon, Congressman John Lewis, there's an essay that he wrote not too long before his passing. It was published July 30th in the New York Times. Lewis urged that we quote, study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change. And that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. And then he continues, though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe, end quote. Now, this language of soul-wrenching existential struggle, this language of the discovery of perennial truth, this language of answering the highest calling of the heart, that's spiritual language, right? It's not specifically religious. So we would not say that this is exclusively Christian language, for example. But it directs us to consider ultimacy as the bedrock of civic engagement, our consideration and contemplation of ultimacy. And spirituality did play a role like this, a central, conscious, deliberate role in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. We know that the civil rights movement was deeply rooted in the institutional Black churches, right? The formal African-American church, Christianity. But the connection between spirituality as such and this remarkable public activism is not commonly understood now, and was not necessarily obvious even to all the participants at the time. So before starting a campaign of civil disobedience, for example, that spiritual connection was deliberately and explicitly drawn through a process that Dr. King called purification. And they would hold these workshops, and in purification workshops, protesters would engage in collective soul searching about their deepest motivations and capacities, the highest calling of the heart that John Lewis described. What spiritual resources can they draw upon to build the courage to lay their bodies down and face the specter of police violence and likely incarceration? What spiritual resources could sustain their disciplined nonviolence? And so the purification workshops gave protesters the opportunity to make the connection between their spirituality and their public activism in authentic conversation with each other. And so it demonstrates historically here something that we find in the current study, something about the power of intentional conversation to link spirituality with civic concern and social action. So that's my historical thought. Thanks, Jillian.
Thank you, Amar. That's great. And Adam, I just wonder where you're sitting with this right now, taking it from the historical to this moment, working at Sojourners as executive director. You see faith-based work in maybe a current context. Can you talk about that a little bit and your insights from this study?
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. First, I also want to thank Fetzer Institute for making the commitment to create this study and having the foresight to create it. I agree with Bob, it is extremely timely and relevant, particularly as we continue to be as a nation in what many have referred to as a cold civil war. We have not been this divided politically, ideologically, racially, really since the 1960s. And there's a great deal of danger in that. But one of the things I reflected on when I had a chance to read an early version of the report is that, at least from my perspective, the findings of this study offer some good news. So in my faith tradition, we think of the gospel as the good news. And there's some good news in this study. I'll just highlight two things that you've heard already, but just to put it fresh in your minds. One is that the more people identify as spiritual, the more likely they are to vote, to speak out about social and political issues, and participate in politics and social movements. And the other is that the more strongly someone identifies as spiritual, the more likely they are to hold pro-social attitudes and take civic and community action. So one of the things that I have certainly felt for a long time, and it's one of the reasons, kind of building on Omar's wonderful reflection just now, that I chose the backdrop that I did, which is an iconic photo from the civil rights movement, is that spirituality is both fuel and oxygen for social and political change. And we have seen that certainly through the context of the civil rights movement. We've also seen it in other movements. The environmental movement in many ways has been rooted and inspired by a deep spirituality. The pro-life movement, taking an issue that may be more conservative or be associated with conservatism, has been motivated by a deep spirituality. And of course, religious conviction. And so there are ways in which spirituality has been a critical engine for social and political change. And I would argue that our democracy atrophies when people disengage, when they join what at least an organization called More in Common describes as the exhausted majority, where people become cynical about our politics, and certainly there's some legitimate reasons to feel cynical, but their response to the brokenness of our politics is to disengage. We lose something very vital. And so I think that there's lots of opportunities to go deeper in terms of how we apply these findings, but at least in this current moment, as we approach the most consequential election, certainly in my lifetime, I think it's important to engage how spirituality is inspiring people to become more involved. And I think that's actually a good thing. The other piece of this, though, is that it also is contributing to pro-social attitudes, to feel more connected to one another, to be more connected to the cause of the common good, which is an aspirational commitment that ties together pretty much every faith tradition, particularly the Judeo-Christian traditions, but also beyond it. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity to continue to apply this. And then the last point I'll make really quickly is that even in more recent movements, and certainly I'm glad Bob mentioned the kind of dual pandemics of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the long-standing and entrenched pandemic of police violence and systemic racism. Within the Black Lives Matter movement, I have experienced and have seen a deep spirituality. It may not be rooted in the Black church in the way that the civil rights movement was, but when you talk to so many activists that have made huge sacrifices to be on the streets and to continue to push for radical change and transformation, there is an incredibly powerful spirituality that is tied up into that movement, both in terms of what inspires them, but also what sustains them. And spirituality at its best both inspires civic action, but it also sustains it. It gives us a resilience in the midst of fighting for change. And I think that's something we desperately need more of right now.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was beautiful. And a couple of themes there that I heard that I think are important is we look at what this connection to something more is that informs our actions. And as you said, Sometimes that's coming from a strong place of a faith perspective, and sometimes it's not. And in the research, we saw different ways that people felt connected to all of humanity that compelled them to take action. So I think there's more to dive into there. There's a lot of nuance. I want to go back to or introduce Vanessa to share a few thoughts as we maybe return to the personal experience of spirituality. We talked a lot about in the last few panelists, Omar and Adam, and beginning with Bob, of thinking about how this connects us to each other and what we do in a moment of unrest or discord. But how does this study tell you, Vanessa, what you know about how we deepen into our spirituality and it helps us? Do you find something in this study that would say that there's hope for us as individuals as we navigate our times?
Thank you for allowing me this time to just share a few of my reflections. As a scholar and a theological educator who focuses on spirituality and particularly spiritual practice, I am very excited about this study and how this study can be a resource for those of us who are teaching and are working and journeying with those who are searching about their spiritualities. Many scholars, spirituality scholars, speak of spirituality as a fundamental dimension of the human experience. For me, I look at the words of Thea Bowman, a Black Franciscan religious sister, and Howard Thurman in looking at spiritualities. Howard Thurman, the mystic and theologian, speaks about the hunger of the heart, and that spirituality and that journey is about that hunger, and that we are moving, the hunger that we have within us is trying to connect with that divine, however we define that divine. And Thea Bowman speaks about spirituality as the soul of the people. And so when I was looking at this document in this study, I really saw those definitions as being reinforced in what I saw, particularly in looking at how we journey in our spirituality. What is it that nurtures that spirituality? And my focus was on the spiritual practice and how these spiritual practices, as there's a book that's called Practicing Our Faith, and it speaks about spiritual practice as they address fundamental needs and conditions through concrete human acts. The practices are done over a course of time and are transformative and guide us to a new way of life. And so when I looked at some of these practices that were mentioned in that section on spiritual practices, practices of prayer, reading, being in nature, attending religious services, studying religious texts, acts of service, practices of fasting, of meditation. What I found is that even though this study was done before COVID, that these practices, many of these practices, and where people found their energy, where people were able to sustain their journey, can be done during this time and can help us journey during this time of the pandemic, of protest, and of this political unrest. That these practices can move us specifically to journeying in hope and give us that energy. And so as I've been teaching virtually online, and in conversations with my students who I hadn't seen the results of this study, they reinforce what this study says. And they have said that if they needed this time to be focused, if they weren't connected to their spiritual practice, it would be very hard for them to continue in this journey. They would not have this sense of hope. And when I speak about hope, that doesn't negate the fact that we're living in difficult times, but there's hope in the midst of these times. And that's what this study, I think, really connects to. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, I think that return to the spiritual well as a phrase that I think I've heard you use, and I've also heard Bob you mention this. And yes, we collected this all pre-COVID, but I think there's a reminder in where we can go to help us in the days ahead. So I think all of this was just fascinating. I wish we could continue on with all of you sharing in more thoughts, but maybe we'll get to hear you again in our Q&A section, which we will get to shortly. I wanted to just go back to Bob, and just as you've heard this conversation unfold, how do you take in this moment of where you hope people listening to this, and we have many of our partners online, others who we know are part of our larger work in the world. What do you hope people really do with this research, and where would you recommend they go next? Let's unmute. Unmute, Bob.
Oh, can't get past that rookie mistake. My biggest hope is that we all take hope from this survey, that we are lifting up, or through this study, a huge resource for us as individuals and as a people, to make an intentional commitment to deepening this part of ourselves, where what the survey is telling us is that we in the large sense, find connection that pulls us out of our fear and out of our small selves, connection to a higher power, connection to other people, connection to the natural world, that I think, to go back to Vanessa's quote from Howard Thurman, answers the searching of our heart. I think the centrality of spirituality is just a reflection that as human beings, we're born with this desire to connect to deep meaning, to deep purpose, to something larger than ourselves. That's not a message our culture serves up very strongly. And so I think all of us who share that hope need to come together and lift up this vision of the beloved community grounded, as Omar said, in a deep spirituality. So thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. That's wonderful. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I want to share just a few kind of next step points, and then we have, well, you all are attending this, have no shortage of eloquent and wonderful comments. I've just been perusing the chat, and just am so grateful that we'll have these chat comments to reflect on and to inform our future work. So thank you so much. And a good number of questions in our Q&A. So we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I wanted to just share that we at Fetzer will be, and we always have been, will encourage more conversations. So we see this research just giving us more fuel to that wonderful fire that we set with so many people, that when in intentional conversation, amazing things happen, not only for ourselves as participants, but for those that we're creating relationship with. And we see that happening with our partners in difficult conversations where there's less agreement, and in conversations when people are coming together in shared purpose and are in agreement. Wonderful things happen in both counts, and we'll be using this research to help inform those further conversations. We have also made this data set available as can be done with some of these larger national research projects. We're glad to be in partnership with ARDA, which for those researchers who are online, this is a website that you can find all of our questions, the questionnaire, and the data set. So you too can look at those findings if you're of a research mind. And we have already seeded some additional research that will be going on over the next 6 months to a year. So that will come next. I want to transition us to to a little bit of Q&A so we can hear from you what your questions are and hear more from our panelists. So I'm going to start with one that I think just that I can answer that comes connects to a comment I just made about continuing conversation. So I see a question that came in our chat, but it may have entered into the chat room from our dear partner, Ibu Patel from IFYC. One of the conversations we've been having is about what's possible with this moment of connection and conversation. And I want to applaud IFYC for a body of research that they've been doing, longitudinal research over the last 4 years, called Ideals, which was looking at the attitudes of college students towards interfaith ideas, towards people of difference, towards their spiritual experience, and attitudes towards others, as I said, in their long college experience, their 4-year college experience. So this was tracking students over time. And what was really clear, and as I talked to Ibu recently, just the clarity that encounters with others that are different makes an enormous difference to how they feel about people that are different. And we know this is common sense, but with these bodies of research now sharing that the moments of connection and conversation make change and difference, then it really is a mandate for all of us to be doing more of that in our work. So I just wanted to respond to that question. It's clear in IFYC's work that, that those meaningful encounters make a significant difference for that person's experience of the other. So I just wanted to lift that up. Thank you for that comment and question, Ibu. We're going to work our way through some of these questions, maybe not in order, but maybe trying to get through as many of them as we can. So thank you for your patience as we do this. So glad that you're all here. We just have 20 more minutes of this conversation. Again, we'll record this and share this out with everyone. So first, a question from Mark Vernon, and I want to field this to Bob, I believe. So Mark, you're asking about why the word spiritual is so appropriate in describing how we open our hearts to others in love, as Bob mentioned. Does it require linking our inner and outer lives, this idea, this word of spirituality? And if you wonder if it's possible to say why this is more than a psychological or a developmental undertaking. And Bob, I'd like to field that to you, and any one of us can chime in if we'd like. And let's make sure you're unmuted.
Okay, there, I think I've got it. Well, I think with this question, I'm shifting from commenting on research about a broad experience of spirituality to my own journey, because for me, the essence of my spiritual journey has been going deep inside and consistently encountering a loving presence greater than myself. And at Fetzer, we think that story goes all the way to the ground. We feel like one of the big challenges of our day for our culture is recovering a profound sense of the sacredness of everyone and everything. And that's an ontological claim. It's a claim that we don't live in a meaningless atomistic reality. We live in a deeply interconnected and sacred reality. And I think it's an ineffable connection in many ways, but what this study is showing is that there is both the hunger, the longing, and the satisfaction of the longing for that deeper connection. And so I think of connecting to spirit, that spirit is really there. So I think it's something way deeper than our cognitive experience and cognitive understanding. So spirituality for me is the natural word. And Mark, thank you and greetings.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
Many scholars, when they speak about spirituality, as I stated earlier, says the fundamental dimension of the human experience. So if we look at the human, and the academic study of spirituality is still quite new, and it is interdisciplinary. And it's interdisciplinary because of the fact, if you're looking at the experience, this human experience of connecting with that transcendent, of connecting to that inner sense, then you have to know psychology, sociology, you have to have anthropology, theology, because all of those aspects and more, you know, I keep on going to many different disciplines, it give you a greater understanding of that human as they're journeying in spirituality. I don't know if that helps.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Well,
I want to move on. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Just quickly, it's also important to note, following on things that Vanessa and Bob just emphasized, that when we think about spirituality as experiential, that, and the study bears this out really as people talk about their own spirituality, it's not necessarily just about a set of interior, isolated experiences or interior dispositions. That when people talk about spirituality, often it's about connection. That is the connection between the inner world and the outer world. And that's one of the most, I think, important things that we'll be able to explore with these data, is the nature of those connections and the ways that spirituality is not necessarily a sort of set of atomistic or isolated or solipsistic, you know, practices or feelings, that it is very much, it can be very much about one's way of being in the world with others in connection.
Right. Right. Thank you, Omar. I want to try to get through a few more of these Q&As, questions, knowing that we're going to run out of time soon. But Veronica, I want to field one to you that was an interesting conversation that we've had, and challenges really in how people identified as religious, as an identity, and how they connect to that. So we have a question from Rory here about how people identified in the research as not at all religious, but she saw in one example had identified as Buddhist. So what are we considering religion? And appreciate the research that Rory is doing. Veronica, can you talk a little bit about that, how we entered into that with the self-identification?
Yes, Rory, you're picking up on one of the more interesting early findings that we came out of the qualitative with, because we found fairly quickly that the maybe traditional questions about spirituality and religiosity didn't necessarily match up with our expectations. And so you're seeing, we actually have quite a few participants who, and in every case that we asked, that to what extent do you consider yourself spiritual, to what extent do you consider yourself religious, we also gave the opportunity to share their religion. And we often had people who said they were not at all religious share a religion. And as we were being able to dig into these conversations, recognizing there's myriad ways that these participants were talking about their relationship with that identity. And so that's where something that really came out of our research is the interest and value of separating identity in terms of how people relate to what it means to call oneself religious, and maybe the burdens or the baggage that they might carry with that word, while also still identifying as part of a group of people or a set of practices or a relationship with others or a community. And so that was something that, again, we saw what you're seeing is not uncommon. And one of the things that from the research, we'd really invite further research to recognize this nuance, because it's not as simple as saying you're religious and your religious identity. There's a lot more to how people are understanding these words, to the point of, is spiritual the right word? What does religious mean? It's very personal, and being able to have the conversations allowed us to get to that nuance.
Thanks, Veronica. If you could stay on cue here, or just to answer another question that was also kind of came up in the qualitative, and Bob, I'd like to have you feel this as well. But Michael asked about how we define pro-social behavior. And some forms of engagement, you know, we may not see, maybe one sees as pro-social, but would we at Fetzer see that as pro-social, or would others see that as pro-social? And I think that's a really interesting question that you're asking, as some sentiments that may be considered pro-social to one are exclusionary or intolerant. So I want to again go back to the research methodology here, where we were looking in their terms, in their words, what might be pro-social, plus leaning on some pretty good scales and surveys that measured this. Veronica, do you want to answer that first? And then Bob, I wanted you to comment about our perspectives on what do we mean by positive spirituality, and is there another side to that?
Yeah, so just from a research perspective, the way we defined pro-social was when we were coding it in, say, open-ended survey responses about pro-social activity, looking for that, we defined it as any action to benefit another person or society, which is we kept fairly open just to see what was coming out. We also used and leaned on, as we did throughout the survey, existing scales of civic and political engagement. And one of those scales, for example, the civic engagement survey, that's the survey that's the scale that includes questions like working with others, I make positive changes in my community. And so that allows us to see, according to other set scales that define what these pro-social behaviors are, how people are tracking against that. And would also just, you know, the asterisk which Bob can build on is, we didn't really determine, we didn't ask, are you doing the right behaviors? Are you taking the right political action? We're really trying to understand just the relationship between any sort of civic and political action. We didn't delve into issues or topics more deeply than that.
Thanks, Veronica. I'll not being as deeply grounded in the research, speak to this from a broader perspective. First off, acknowledging that not all spirituality is life-affirming. Not all spirituality is pro-social. We think of the spirituality of the Ku Klux Klan or of the Nazi movement or Al-Qaeda, and we see how powerful life-denying spirituality can also be. So I think all of us that are interested in this subject, first off, need to wrestle conceptually with how we would differentiate the two, and then wrestle practically about how we can increase the amount of life-affirming and reduce the amount of life-denying spirituality in the world. Mindful of time, I'll just say, in our long-term goals statement at Fetzer, we talk about trying to inspire and support broad-scale spiritually grounded transformation from an ego-centered way of being grounded in separation and fear to an all-centered way of being grounded in wholeness and love. And I would say that within that Fetzer frame, life-affirming spirituality is that spirituality that deepens us into a way of being, an all-centered way of being grounded in wholeness and love.
Can I jump in real quickly on this one? So in addition to the pro-social actions and attitudes, I think part of what I see in this study, and this is where further research could kind of further elucidate this, is that spirituality helps us identify with and embrace a bigger we. And I think it's really important, particularly in the midst of this contentious election, whatever the outcome is, we are still going to be a severely divided nation. And the degree to which part of the narrative of this election is a battle over who is the we the people, who does that include, who does that exclude, and how do we try to embrace a bigger we that hopefully can enable us to overcome some of the ways in which we're being pulled apart at the seams as a nation. And so, you know, I think that is connected to spirituality, and if it is, then spirituality provides a really important resource and antidote to how we do some of that healing, reconciliation, ultimately transformation that is so needed in this next chapter.
Really beautiful. Thank you, Adam. And you also pointed in your language to something that I would like you all to know that is throughout the report, and you'll also see them as entries on the blog on the Spirituality Study website. But in fact, one of your fellow advisors, Ruth Braunstein, her expert analysis on the studies was around the study was on the theme of connection, and her insight is titled "From I to We." So I think in your words, Adam, I'm recalling what Ruth wrote, and that was a significant insight from her. So I invite you all to peruse what our advisors shared as they were seeing this research and saw it through their eyes and their scholarship. We don't have too much time left, so I want to again assure you that all of these questions will be saved, and we may think of some creative ways either through blog posts to answer some of these questions. I think that's probably a real effective way to go about it so that we can get to them. I'm sure you're seeing the questions yourself and wanting them to be answered. So I think we'll do one more and we'll share just a little next steps after that. Ed, I think this is a really great question, and I don't know that we'll have all the answers for you, though we have a lot of evidence. What insights emerged from this study regarding the shift away from religion and into spirituality? Are people discovering spirituality as a solitary or experiential path, or are they following spiritual organizations or spiritual thought leaders? And you cite some research that Pew has done on the decline of Christianity. I want Veronica and any others to share on this. I'll just say that again, we were not looking to find out how spirituality, or is spirituality a replacement for religion. That wasn't a hypothesis we went into this study with. In fact, what you see in some of the findings is that many people identify as both spiritual and religious and still have rich religious lives. I think what's interesting here is that the idea is very nuanced, and that we weren't setting into this, nor did we find that this was a dichotomy, that you're either one or the other. In fact, they're different concepts that mean different things to people. Some see them together and some see them very much as separate ideas. Veronica, do you want to expand any more? And then I'll share just a little bit about what our partners are experiencing in terms of spiritual support.
Yes, so I can speak a little bit to it. Of course, this is part of a much broader and wider investigation in terms of the relationship between spirituality and religion research that Nork and Pew and others have done for a long time, that we are just stepping into and providing a different angle on. One of the things that I would lift up in this conversation about what is often framed as a shift from religion into spirituality is in the report, you'll see page 42, 3 in 5 people think that religion and spirituality are either the same or more similar than they are different. So 43% say religion and spirituality are more similar than they are different. 17%, 1 in 5 say religion and spirituality are the same. And so having had experiences in focus groups and in interviews where we deliberately were not the first people to ever say religion, we wanted to see if and how it came up and in what context, that we often had conversations where people were really confused about why we would ever talk about them differently. You'd hear one person say, well, I think spirituality is like this and religion is like this. And another focus group participant would say, what are you talking about? They're the same thing. And so I think acknowledging some of the interesting dichotomies there of just how people are thinking of these ideas and these terms, and how that might get be wrapped up in the way people are thinking about their relationship to spirituality. I think we also see that people's spirituality is showing up not just in these formal structures, but also in a lot of maybe personal exploration. And what we then saw in conversation is when they started to make the connection, hearing others describe the relationship between this maybe inner experience and outer action, that it made sense but that it wasn't necessarily top of mind for everyone. And so thinking of where people are going to get that, this certainly doesn't have the answer, but hopefully a lot of fodder to think about what we can tap into.
Thank you, Veronica. And just seeing just a few minutes here. Thank you all for staying with us here through the Q&A period as well. Just to follow up on Veronica's answer there too, that certainly in Fetzer's experience, community and connection makes a significant difference. And we see that, that experience with our partners when they're talking about spirituality within traditions and definitely outside of traditions. So this will be, we'll be continuing to work with partners who explore innovations in spiritual community and support for people. So that's always been a part of our work and will continue to be within and outside of tradition and where people need support. I'm also recalling Nancy Ammerman's insight in the study, in the report, and talking about how it matters who you're talking to and where that support is coming from. So you might want to read her words as well. Well, I am, an hour and a half went by very fast. We're all, I'm sure, sad to see this go because we could continue on for the afternoon. We look forward to sharing more with you in blog posts with the many, many wonderful questions that came in that we were not able to answer, and some of your great comments. So thank you for your interest and your support. I want to just quickly share while I have a minute. Two things. This is one of the drawings that we'll be sending out. If you can see that, this is from our lovely Rana Alexander. Just sharing what she was hearing as our key questions. She always does such a beautiful job. Thank you, Rana, for sharing on that. And then I want to show you just for a moment the website that we've been talking about. Pretty extraordinary to explore the findings. Hopefully some of you have already had a chance to peruse this site. If you haven't, please take a look. I'm just going to show you just one thing. So what's, I think, most innovative about this, and we thank our friends at Interactive Knowledge for helping create this site to explore the findings, is the interactive map that allows you to explore the findings. So you can see, I can drag around here, and how you can find a finding. So here 72% of people feel that they are at least somewhat accountable to a higher power. And you'll find for how they define that, you'll find the findings there. And then you'll find other drawings and relationships to the data there. So we think that this is just a really wonderful way to explore the findings. So it's kind of like we said, a choose your own adventure. So we hope you'll find some time to peruse the site. I think that that's it. We're just 1 minute over, and I really want to acknowledge all of our fantastic participants that you joined us in our audience. Thank you. And to these wonderful panelists. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Tom, Mohammed. Thank you for joining. Vanessa, Omar, Bob, and Adam, of course. Wonderful group, and you all were fantastic. I hope you all enjoyed this. Go to spiritualitystudy.org for more, and we'll continue the conversation.